On August 25th, President Trump announced that the Department of Justice will sue the state of California over the efforts of California Democrats, led by Governor Gavin Newsom, to draw a new Democratic-leaning congressional map. At the same time, a new map in Texas is also being challenged in court. Hello, friends. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and welcome to We the People, a weekly show of constitutional debate. The National Constitution Center is a nonpartisan nonprofit chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people. This week, by popular demand, we are reconvening Professors Nicholas Stephanopoulos and Bradley Smith to discuss gerrymandering. We discussed racial gerrymandering a few weeks ago, and we're back to discuss the history and future of partisan gerrymandering, including those new redistricting efforts in Texas and California. Bradley Smith is Josiah H. Blackmore II Shirley M. Nault Professor of Law at Capital University Law School. He served on the Federal Election Commission from 2000 through 2005, including as the commission's chairman during the presidential election year of 2004. Brad, it is so great to welcome you back to We the People by popular demand.
It is always a pleasure, Jeff. Good to see you.
And Nick Stephanopoulos is the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, a scholar at the forefront of election law and democratic theory. Nick is the author of Aligning Election Law and has been involved in several cases about partisan gerrymandering. Nick, it's wonderful to welcome you back to We the People.
Thanks for having me.
Let's jump in with the ongoing redistricting efforts in Texas and California. Nick, what's going on and how historically unusual is this?
What's going on is that we're seeing a basically unprecedented bout of voluntary mid-decade redistricting going on. So the norm in America for more than a century has been once per decade redistricting. The new census comes out, states draw the lines at that point, and then use the maps over the ensuing 10 years. What's happening now is that, as we know, the U.S. House was very close. It's narrowly divided. And there's a strong tendency for the out-of-power party to make large gains in midterm elections. President Trump would prefer not to lose control of the U.S. House. And so he's looking for additional seats that Republicans can squeeze out of maps across the country. Texas is the beginning of this, but there are also serious efforts to redraw maps in Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, and elsewhere. And so the effort that's going on basically is one to take a U.S. House that in aggregate is quite balanced, quite fair right now. And there's an attempt to skew the U.S. House in Republicans' favor by redrawing a bunch of maps and turning them into more potent Republican gerrymanders. If that happens, that would increase the likelihood of Republicans holding on to the House after the 2026 election, which appears to be Trump's goal here. And I'll just reiterate that there was an era in American history more than a century ago, in the Gilded Age, when mid-decade redistricting was common. This has been basically unheard of in the 20th and 21st centuries, other than a few exceptions, usually involving some kind of litigation. This sort of just discretionary redrawing of district lines is something we haven't seen in a very long time in the middle of the decade. But that's the kind of arms race that we're now entering.
Thanks so much for that. Brad, how would you describe what's going on? Do you agree that this is unprecedented since the Gilded Age? And how would you describe the parameters?
I would not say it's unprecedented, but I think Nick's is basically right. I mean, it's an uncommon thing. We saw this done in Texas after the 2000 cycle when the Democrats still controlled the state legislature and heavily gerrymandered the state. And when Republicans took over the state legislature in 2002, they then redistricted for Congress to make it more fair for Republicans. As Nick knows, there's sometimes when it's been ordered by the courts, and in the deep past, it was pretty common. Today, it is largely a partisan trench warfare. I would note that in Ohio, where I'm from and live, the redistricting is actually required by law. The state is required to do redistricting now. It has to do with the setup of an independent redistricting commission that was done a couple years ago. And so I do think it's not, in my mind, a healthy trend to have these mid-decade redistrictings. It's one of the things where you are probably better off to have sort of a truce between the parties. Everybody agrees you're going to redistrict once a decade. Having said that, I mean, part of the Republican position is that we know that the 2020 census made errors that uniformly favored Democratic-leaning states, contributing about 3 or 4 extra congressional seats to those states that presumably favor Democrats. That would be a fairly significant swing in the very narrow House. And depending on who you look at, as Nick says, the House right now is almost perfectly proportional. If you think proportional should be the standard based on sort of nationwide aggregate vote, but it does tend to lean ever so slightly in favor of Democrats. So for that reason, I mean, one could draw up a defense of this, but basically it is an effort by Republicans to make sure that they can retain the majority and an effort by Democrats to make sure that they gain the majority. And in my mind, this is what partisan districting is. And it's gerrymandering is not nearly as significant as people think. We're talking a few seats. It matters so much now only because the House is so closely divided. But generally speaking, you have to draw lines, and parties are going to draw lines that tend to favor the party that's in power. That's just the reality of what redistricting is. And so I think in a way we're tying ourselves in knots over this gerrymandering question when we probably have many more serious issues to deal with for the health of our democracy.
Nick, tell us more about the history. Why was the gerrymandering so extreme during the Gilded Age? Why did it become less so for much of the 20th century? And what are the costs of the gerrymanders today? Brad said that the House is perfectly proportioned. Help us explain what perfect apportionment means, and also introduce your idea of the alignment gap and tell us whether or not we should be concerned about it today.
Yeah, great. So a quick history of gerrymandering, I guess, would be that in the Gilded Age, we had basically the same settings that we see in place today. Hotly contested national elections, both parties being very close to majorities in Congress. And so both parties realized that they could squeeze out more seats by just redrawing districts all the time rather than once per decade. And so we're now approaching, again, the logical endpoint of our system of partisan districting, but we've been there before, and that was in the 1870s, 1880s. The reason that stopped is that in the 1896 election, Republicans won a big, comfortable majority. At the same time that Democrats basically took full control of the South after fully disenfranchising African Americans. And so in the decades after the 1890s, both parties were already dominant in their respective regions, and they didn't have the same incentive to keep tinkering with district lines. What happened instead in the early to mid 20th century is that many states stopped redistricting at all. And so rather than having mid-decade redistricting, we went decades without any redistricting in many states and ended up with enormous population deviations from one district to another. And it's that extreme, really staggering malapportionment that then caused the U.S. Supreme Court to hold in the 1960s that equal district population is required. And so since the 1960s, we've been in the modern era where redistricting occurs once per decade, typically under a rule of one person, one vote. And it's only now that states and politicians are realizing that there's nothing sacred about redistricting once per decade. And if you can achieve some additional advantage by redistricting more often, you might as well do it. When it comes to the costs of gerrymandering, we're very fortunate right now to have a U.S. House that in aggregate is almost perfectly neutral. And that's great. That means that neither party is earning unwarranted seats in the U.S. House. We don't have representation. We don't have policy in the U.S. House that is out of whack with what Americans actually want. But note that this aggregate balance is the product of a lot of state-level gerrymanders just fortuitously happening to offset one another. And there's no guarantee that state-level gerrymanders will offset as opposed to piling up. So in the 2010s, there were many more Republican than Democratic gerrymanders. And so all of those state-level Republican gerrymanders added up to a U.S. House that was dramatically skewed in a Republican direction. In earlier decades, in the 70s and 80s, there were many more Democratic than Republican gerrymanders. And those Democratic gerrymanders added up to a U.S. House that was skewed in favor of Democrats. And that's why you had, for example, Ronald Reagan harshly condemning gerrymandering and advocating independent redistricting, nonpartisan solutions. No one should think that one side always does it. Both sides do it. And when either side is the victim of gerrymandering, that side tends to advocate for reform. So you mentioned alignment. My idea of alignment is a pretty intuitive one. It's that representation and policy ought to accurately reflect what people want in a jurisdiction. We don't want to have either representation or policy that is too liberal or too conservative, given public opinion in the city or the state or the country. And so from an alignment perspective, the enormous danger of gerrymandering is that probably more than any other modern policy, it has really a stark misaligning potential. Gerrymandering can award the gerrymandering party 10%, 15% more seats than it would win under a different map. There's basically no modern policy with the power to swing that many seats. If you imagine Democrats in control of Texas, they could flip 10, 15, 20 seats. There's no voting law, there's no campaign finance law, there's no primary regulation with nearly that potential to influence representation and policy. And so the reason I worry a lot about gerrymandering is precisely because it's so potent and so much more potent than most of the other electoral policies that we tend to talk about.
Brad, do you agree or disagree with Nick's description of the history? And then tell us about his idea of the alignment gap. Do you agree or disagree that the potential that a party could get 10 to 15 more seats than it would otherwise get is of concern?
Yeah, so let me start, before I get into the specific history of gerrymandering, if I can, since we're talking history, I think listeners of a podcast like this should know a touch more about Elbridge Gerry than most probably do. Most Americans know nothing about this man, Elbridge Gerry, for whom this term is named, or as he is said to have pronounced it, Gary. But Elbridge Gerry was a member of the Continental Congress. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He signed the Articles of Confederation. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention and was one of a handful that refused to sign it because it did not contain a Bill of Rights. Also, he was upset by the 3/5 compromise clause on counting slaves for apportionment. But despite refusing to sign the Constitution, Massachusetts elected him as a congressman, sent him back to Washington. where he was instrumental in the Bill of Rights. Next to Madison, he may have been the most important person in shaping the Bill of Rights. It's largely to Elbridge Gerry that we owe the Fourth Amendment. It's largely to his efforts that we owe the right to assemble under the First Amendment. It's also largely due to his efforts at the original Constitutional Convention that U.S. senators vote individually as individual senators rather than voting, one vote per state. So anyway, he does this. He goes back to Massachusetts. He gets elected governor. Then he becomes vice president of the United States. And the only thing, this is a man who's done almost everything. And the only thing that most Americans remember him for, if they even associate the term gerrymandering with his name, is gerrymandering, which was signing a redistricting bill that he didn't write. And in fact, he didn't even like very much, but his party had proposed it. And so he went ahead as governor and signed it. And in fact, at the time, he was known as one of the least partisan sort of the early founders, resisted joining a party for a long time. He was a elector for John Adams in 1796, Adams, the Federalist candidate, although he was later, when he finally moved into the party orbit, he joined the Democratic Republican Party. So I just think that Americans should remember Elbridge Gerry a bit more than we do. Now, to the roots of gerrymandering, I think Nick's description is essentially correct. I wouldn't really quarrel with it. But what I would note then is, as we think about it and think about the idea that it can lead to non-alignment, is the question of why do we have geographic districts? We have geographic districts. They're not supposed to be proportional. There's nothing, once you have geographic districting, you may get rough proportionality, but you very likely could not. As I often say, if you took a state that was, 51% in favor of one party and the voters were evenly distributed and you had totally non-gerrymandered districts, how many seats would the majority party win? They'd win all 100, or they'd win 100% of those seats. They'd win them all, 51 to 49. So geographic districting is not supposed to reflect proportional votes so much as it is supposed to represent the concerns and interest of geographic areas. Now, maybe that's not a good system anymore, where geography is not as important as it was back in the 18th and 19th centuries, but geography still shapes an awful lot of the interest in the United States. And I think we need to, remember that. The second element is that congressmen, when we think about the House, elections for Congress are not supposed to create a nationally proportionate House of Representatives. I mean, again, most people seem to think that that's good. So, okay, fine, I'm willing to go with that. But the races are not supposed to be so about national issues. The very idea of geographic districting is candidates are bringing their local issues to the national legislature to make sure that the national legislature thus really considers the good of the whole, that the majority doesn't just rule because they get most of the seats and they just do what they want and ignore the minority. And I think over the last couple of decades, we've forgotten a lot of those principles. We've concentrated power in the federal government, which makes it more and more important and makes these races more and more nationalized. And we've become just much more partisan in our politics, so that we see these bills consistently over the last 2 decades that are all Democratic bills, such as, the Inflation Reduction Act, or all Republican bills, such as the One Big Beautiful Bill, with everybody from the opposition party without fail voting the opposite way. We've consigned ourselves to a one-party government. And I think this comes from a lot of things outside of gerrymandering. And I think when we look at gerrymandering, we look at the issue, we need to decide to some extent, and this to me is a big problem, we haven't really decided what is it we want from redistricting. Do we want competitive seats, or do we want safe seats, which lowers the cost of campaigning, makes more people happy the day after the election because their candidate won, maybe gives candidates more room to compromise if they feel their seats are safe, although that may be undermined by primaries. Do we want to keep, what communities of interest do we want to keep together? Here in Ohio, we have a large Amish community. Should that Amish community be kept together? Or is that one that you can split up? A lot of people think the Amish don't vote, but they can and they do, usually not in large numbers. But when they do, they tend to vote very heavily Republican. So you can concentrate them in one district, or you can spread them out, making a number of districts a little more Republican. The bigger question perhaps is, should we have sort of an Amish district? Should we include Jewish communities of interest, racial minorities, other religious minorities? What about, geographic areas? So all of these things fit together. And focusing on one item, to me, is always very dangerous. And just a quick example to wrap up. One such example is the one person, one vote cases that Nick referenced. The court was reacting, I think, to what Nick correctly describes as extreme imbalance in population between districts. For example, one state legislative district in Vermont had fewer than 30 people in it, and another had over 40,000, if I remember right. So you could have these huge variations, and the court couldn't think of a real answer to that other than equally populated districts. But once you made equally populated districts, it makes it much easier to gerrymander, because before you might say, well, look, we stop at the city limits, or we stop at the county limits, or we stop at the river, a geographic barrier, a mountain range, a desert area. But now you can't do that if the populations are not equal. So you have to cross those lines. And once you say you have to cross those lines, there's 1,500 ways that the legislature can choose to start crisscrossing lines. And so you get more gerrymandering. So I just use that as an example that, whenever we try to focus on one element of the system and say, this is it, this is what is so important, we tend to overlook that all these things work together and they're going to play on one another and not necessarily give us the results that we want.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for your shout out to Elbridge Gerry. I was so excited to share with We the People listeners that history. I have in front of me a great book called The Founders on the Founders, with contemporary observations about Gerry and others. And we have Timothy Pickering writing to John Marshall that his conduct is characterized with timidity, indecision, and meanness and treachery. And Charles Coatsworth Pinckney writes, I've never met a man of less candor and so much duplicity as Mr. Gerry. These are Federalists who are appalled that he's gone over and become Jefferson's vice president and feel that he's switched parties. He clearly inspired a lot of partisan concern during the founding, but also, as you note, he was quite principled in defending rights when he refused to sign the Constitution. Nick, anything more on the great Gerry for We the People listeners? And then your thoughts about Brad's suggestion that there are infinite considerations that go into a geographically based districting system, and there's no particular reason that any one neutral result could emerge.
Yeah, great. I appreciated Brad's comments about Gerry, who I agree is underrated and unfairly pigeonholed into this model as the great gerrymanderer, when that's not at all a fair description of his career. Wanted to say that on the roots of geographic single-member districts, Brad is exactly right that they go back to a very different era, and they're motivated by a very different political theory from the ones that we mostly hear today. So the reason why we got geographic districts centuries ago in Britain and in colonial America was to represent coherent geographic, nonpartisan communities in the legislature. So the idea was you wanted to have a district for the fishermen, a district for the mine workers, a district for the farmers, a district for the Amish community over here. And you get this kaleidoscope of different representatives in the legislature, all representing the distinctive interests of their particular geographic community. It's pretty clear that America today doesn't follow this model, right? Like the whole reason why Trump is on the warpath looking for more Republican districts is because he doesn't care at all about the representation of coherent geographic communities. He's approaching politics from a purely national partisan perspective. And his goal is more Republican seats, with no thought being given at all to which communities are or aren't going to be respected as a consequence. We can also tell that most modern line drawers don't believe in the old communitarian theory of districting because coherent communities are ripped up and divided left and right by modern district maps. Texas already did this, and the new Texas map takes it to another extent. The basic pattern of the new Texas congressional map is sprawling pinwheel districts that start near urban areas, take in 40, 45% Democrats, but then spiral out hundreds of miles into the ex-urban and rural countryside and pick up 55, 60% Republicans. There is zero effort being made to respect communities of rural workers, ex-urban residents, suburban residents. The entire goal is partisan gain, even at the massive cost to coherent geographic communities all across Texas. And this is pretty typical of both sides' gerrymanders across the country. As we kind of face a choice, we can either abandon geographic districting because most elites today don't believe in the basic premises of geographic districting, or we can try to kind of muddle through by maintaining geographic districting, but also paying some attention to aggregate fairness statistics. And it kind of fortunately turns out that in many, not all, but many states, it's possible to design maps that do a pretty good job of abiding by traditional line drawing criteria and also achieve fairness at an aggregate partisan level, which is what most American elites now care about. So I'd be fine with abandoning geographic districting, but we don't face that stark a choice just because it usually is possible, especially with the advances in modern line drawing technology, to have the best of both worlds, to design maps that are compact and respect county and city and community boundaries, but also are reasonably fair in how they treat the major parties, which is what national level elites care about. Couple more points just in response to things that Brad said. I agree with Brad's take on the one person, one vote revolution of the 1960s. Equal district population is a good thing, keeping everything else constant. But I also kind of think the court went a little bit overboard in insisting on nearly absolute population equality. Population equality matters, but so does partisan fairness, so does competitiveness, so does compliance with traditional criteria. And I don't think there's a good reason to insist on perfect population equality when we're downplaying many of the other equally significant goals of redistricting. And then on competitiveness, I'll just note that it's an independent good that is distinct from partisan fairness. We can think of maps that are fair in partisan terms where many districts are competitive, or we can think of maps that are fair in partisan terms and the maps are wholly split into safe seats for one side and safe seats for the other side. So I think it's important not to confuse or conflate competitiveness with partisan fairness. They're both good things, but they're just independent values.
Thank you so much for that. Brad, this great conversation is helping listeners understand that it's hard to achieve first, equal population, second, compactness, and third, goals like incumbency protection at the same time. And one reason districts started getting so oddly shaped after the one person, one vote decisions is that the requirement of exact equal population made it hard to maintain compactness and incumbency protection. How important is regular shaped districts? The original gerrymander was named after a district that snaked around so much it looked like a salamander. Justice O'Connor in the racial gerrymandering case said compactness matters and there could be representational harms when districts look really funny. In addition to the representational harms, do you think that fairness ultimately matters? And if districts get so funnily shaped that a party doesn't get a roughly proportionate share of the seats that it wins, is that of concern or not?
Yeah, I do think that fairness is a value. It's because we have a lot of values that should go into this. I kind of chuckled to myself, Jeff, as you said, mentioned how difficult it was to combine compactness and if you want to protect incumbents and, communities of interest and all these kinds of things. But here Nick is right. On the other hand, you have to start with somebody who wants to actually achieve those objectives. And it's not clear that our line drawers do, that too often they ignore those kinds of issues completely. So again, what are the potential options here? I mean, one would be to simply try to institutionalize certain fairness obligations. For example, 10 states now have in their state constitutions that you cannot do mid-decade redistricting. Maybe that would be a good thing. Congress has, in recent Congresses, Democrats have floated various bills that would essentially nationalize the electoral process much more than I would favor. But Congress does have the authority over the time, place, and manner of elections. Congress it's a congressional statute that requires that we have single-member districts. Congress could presumably include criteria on how those are to be drawn in terms of compactness, whether it's not crossing, political lines like cities and counties, or not crossing certain geographic barriers, things like that. That might lead to more litigation in the courts at the end of the day, but maybe that wouldn't be a bad thing either. So, again, Nick's right. Our society is different. As I said right at the beginning, it may be that geographic districting doesn't make sense. On the other hand, I still think that a certain amount of geographic districting makes a lot of sense. And then we're back to the compactness issue. How compact? Normally, I think you'd want to look at a compact district. But on the other hand, take Ohio as a congressional district that snakes along the Ohio River from up near Pittsburgh, across the border from Pittsburgh, almost all the way down along the Ohio River to Cincinnati. And one can argue, that's districts that's not compact at all. On the other hand, those cities and towns along the Ohio River have a lot in common in terms of what they need in terms of policy, industrial policy, tax policy, welfare policy. They have a tremendous amount in common. So sometimes you create districts that really are a community of interest and yet are not terribly compact. Other times, it's going to be compact. And that takes me back to the point that almost all of this is political. You have to make political choices. And you can try to further hem in those choices by saying that we should follow various principles, and various standards have been proposed. Nick's mentioned one today that he hasn't really had a chance to explain too deeply how it works. But there are others that have been thrown out there, I'm blanking out on the names right now, but there are 3 or 4 different standards that people have thrown out for how we ought to redistrict. But I don't think that should be the overarching value. So we're back to this question: how do we balance all these things out? And I know it's kind of a cop-out for this conversation, but I would kind of tend to go back to something Nick said right at the outset. One of the first things we can do is say we're not going to do mid-decade redistricting, that would just create a certain normalization, a certain fact that, the war takes place, but it takes place once a decade, and then people move and voters, shift around, and it's hard to predict what's going to happen a decade out. And maybe for starters, that's the best we can do. In the interim, I think we need to think more seriously about what it is that we want districting to do, or would we really want to consider abandoning geographic districting, which would be obviously a huge change in how American elections have always been run.
Nick, what do you think that we should want out of redistricting? Or more specifically, why don't you talk more about the standard that Brad mentioned? I think it's the efficiency gap, you've called it. You're the leading defender of it. What does it measure? And what about Brad's suggestion that fairness is not the only consideration in districting? There are others too, and ultimately the balance among these different considerations is political.
Yeah, great. So I agree that redistricting has numerous objectives: compliance with traditional criteria, competitiveness, aggregate partisan fairness, for which the efficiency gap is one possible measure. Also going back to our conversation a week or two ago, representing minority voters has been a goal as well for the last several decades. We'll see if that goal survives the Calais case that's pending in front of the Supreme Court. My view is that we don't really have to choose between these different objectives because there generally are district maps that do a passable job on all of these measures. The problem with our modern gerrymanders isn't that line drawers are trying their best but failing to balance different objectives. What's going on in California or Texas or Florida or North Carolina or Illinois is the single-minded pursuit of one goal, which is partisan bias in favor of the line-drawing party, at the expense of most or all other redistricting goals. So, if we're starting with a line drawer who isn't hell-bent on partisan advantage, it is perfectly feasible to design pretty good maps in most or all states. We now have really significant, really dramatic advances in redistricting technology. The most important of these is the development of algorithms that can spit out thousands, millions of district maps at random, but satisfying whatever parameters the user specifies. So, I have friends who use these techniques. If I tell them, give me many options for a map for Texas that respects counties and cities better than the current map, has more compact districts than the current map, has more competitive districts than the current map, represents minority voters better than the current map, and is way, way, way more fair than the current map in aggregate, they'll produce, thousands, millions of maps satisfying those criteria, in the blink of an eye. And so it is true there are multiple objectives in redistricting, but unless you're really trying to achieve one objective at the expense of all the others, it's not necessary to make really stark trade-offs among these different goals. And so the congressional bills that Brad referred to, they included a partisan fairness requirement using the efficiency gap metric that Brad mentioned and that I've been involved in developing. But they didn't pursue partisan fairness at the expense of all other goals. The congressional bill said that you've got to follow traditional criteria. You've got to follow the Voting Rights Act, which means creating some number of minority opportunity districts. And presumptively, you can't exceed a certain efficiency gap threshold unless you show us that it's necessary to exceed that threshold in order to draw maps that are VRA compliant or sufficiently compact or sufficiently congruent with city or county or other community boundaries. And so the congressional bills introduced a partisan fairness criterion, but they didn't elevate it over all of the other goals. They just said, since it's possible in almost all circumstances to do both, to do partisan fairness and compliance with traditional criteria and compliance with the VRA, that should be the norm, unless this happens to be the rare case where it isn't possible to achieve all those goals simultaneously. And I think that's a pretty good model for reform. It's not a zealot's model. It doesn't exalt partisan fairness over everything else. It recognizes that partisan fairness is a valid, important consideration. It's the only one people like Trump and Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer are thinking about. And it would give us a fair U.S. House, not just fortuitously when gerrymanders happen to offset, but basically all the time, because we'd be aggregating fair maps. And when we aggregate fair maps, we'd get a fair U.S. House. And I think that would be a better, more reflective, more durable democracy for us to have at the federal level.
Brad, what do you think of Nick's suggestion as a policy matter, a version of the congressional bill that would balance fairness against other considerations? Has this been adopted successfully by the states? What do you think of nonpartisan redistricting commissions, which you've expressed skepticism about because you say that many of the states that have adopted them are in fact worse than systems that use overtly political redistricting body? And what, in your views, are the most promising models for reform?
Right. Well, I mean, I have a couple of angles to approach this. One is I'm always skeptical of imposing as a constitutional standard something that's not in the Constitution. Now, I understand that courts sometimes make decisions on what they think are workable standards to enforce constitutional rights. But when I look at things like the efficiency gap or some of the other standards that have been proposed, I'm always find myself feeling like, where is that in the Constitution? The Supreme Court is just kind of picking a standard, much as it did with the one vote, one one person, one vote cases, kind of misnamed cases, actually, because they don't result in one person, one vote. We'll call them the equally populated district cases of the 1960s. It's not that I think those cases were wrong, given the facts at the time necessarily, but the court chose to impose a standard that it was not in the Constitution, and it has created some unwanted consequences as well, consequences that are often overlooked. So, I'm always leery about taking that approach. When we look at redistricting, even under the FAIR maps, I'm not convinced that you're always going to get this nice, neat national proportionality, because one of the things you have is that states are doing the redistricting, and especially smaller states, the things like the efficiency gap don't work that well when you have small numbers of congressional representatives. It's like almost like statistical sampling. If you got a sample with only 5 people or 7 people, you can't count on the validity of what you're getting, and you're going to get lopsided results, which are not because of intent, they're just chance, right? It works better at the state level. If you're at the Pennsylvania House where you've got 200 representatives, it starts to make a bit more sense. But I'm leery about it. And I'm leery about it, the idea that, well, let's just balance these factors. I mean, I guess I would say I think that's what we've been doing, at least legally. That's what we've been doing. That's been the legal requirements. I think, again, Nick is correct, as I indicated earlier, that it's not clear that our line drawers want to draw districts that follow, compact lines and traditional criteria and so on. But redistricting commissions haven't been that great either. For example, in Arizona, Republicans got 52% of the aggregated vote last time out. They have 67% of the seats. In California, Democrats got about 61% of the vote. They've got about 83% of the seats. Now they're going to gerrymander to get more. Washington State, Colorado, both pretty lopsided. Colorado Democrats got about an aggregate of 54% of the vote. They've got about 2/3 of the seats. So I'm not sure that these independent redistricting commissions have been proven to be any more successful, in part because they tend to be manipulated by people who have, clear partisan goals. And part of the whole idea of putting together these independent commissions is we're going to get a bunch of people together who aren't partisan, which almost by definition means, not entirely, I'm going to overstate this, but to a large extent means people who don't follow politics that closely, who don't really understand redistricting. And so they get manipulated by the major parties, and you end up with lines that don't do any more for us in terms of getting to some type of proportionality. And so I keep coming back to, as much as I hate to say it, I don't think gerrymandering is a good thing. I just think it's a thing. It's kind of inseparable from geographic districting. I don't think we can do a lot about it without triggering a whole bunch of other consequences. And again, I simply don't think that it is the problem that it is claimed to be. If you didn't have this gerrymandering going on, it's hard for me to see where our politics would be much different, or our national policy would be much different over the last couple of decades. I'm sympathetic to Nick's argument that the potential for disaster is there. I'm always sympathetic to that argument. I view the Constitution as sort of a, in case of emergency, break glass document. And so we should be conscious of that emergency possibility. But right now, I just don't see that we're there. And I think that we would do better to think more seriously about how we vote, what we want our representatives to do, what we reward them for doing. I think you can make reforms in congressional internal politics in Congress. And I just think that we're spending a lot of time and effort on something that I don't think people are going to see major changes. I'll just give one quick example. Here in my state of Ohio, there was an effort last fall to put in a new redistricting system that was supposedly be more impartial than the supposedly impartial system that was implemented just a few years ago. But I point out to people that in Ohio nowadays, it's not the Ohio of 2000 or 2004. Statewide candidates vote, the vote for Republicans is typically about 58 to 62%. The aggregate vote for state legislature is typically about 55 to 60% Republican. If you have proportional representation, you're going to have a very solid Republican majorities. And it's not clear to me that you're really going to get the different policy or sense that what some people want. And ultimately, I think what people really want out of this is policy. I do think fairness we all abstractly agree to, but in the end, most people want policy. Nobody complains, just like nobody complains when their candidate outspends the opponent, only when the opponent outspends them. People complain about gerrymandering, as Nick said, when they're not in control of it. Once they're in control of it, it doesn't seem to be that big of a problem. And I just think that's the hard reality of the issue. So I'm not against all issues of reform. One thing Congress could do would be give states a little more ability to experiment in congressional districting, to create multi-member districts, things like that. But I'm very skeptical that we're going to find a solution here to what ails us.
Nick, what's your response to Brad's argument that the Constitution is a break the glass situation and we're not there yet? He suggests that independent commissions can lead to lopsided results, just like partisan commissions, and that by and large, we're not in a situation where there are serious policy or representational gaps. Tell us what's going on in the states. Ever since the U.S. Supreme Court got out of the business of policing partisan gerrymandering entirely, there's a lot of variety in the states. Are there some examples in the states of extreme fairness and representational and policy gaps? And what can we learn from what's going on the ground?
Yeah, great. I would say that the conversation we're mainly having right now is about policy, not constitutional law. So in discussing what metric Congress might want to use in a bill, that's a very, very different conversation from what metric the Supreme Court ought to endorse in a partisan gerrymandering claim. I have views on the jurisprudence here as well, but I've at least been mainly talking about what kinds of options are available as a policy matter, not as a matter of constitutional litigation. Although I'd be happy to talk about that too. Why do I think gerrymandering is a problem? Because of not just its potential, but its actual record of hugely skewing representation and policy in certain instances. So at the federal level, look at what happened in 2012 after what's been called the Great Republican Gerrymander of 2010, 2011. Voters across the country preferred Democratic candidates for the U.S. House. But because of a wave of Republican gerrymanders in basically all purple states, what the voters got back was not the Democratic House they wanted. It was a House with something like a 30-seat Republican advantage. American history, the policies enacted by the federal government would look quite different if we had had the Democratic U.S. House that American voters wanted in 2013, 2014. I believe the Senate was still under Democratic control then. So gerrymandering was the entire reason why we didn't have unified Democratic control of Washington to start Obama's second term. Those policy consequences are enormous, and that's an awful lot of distortion of policy directly attributable to the wave of Republican gerrymandering in 2010 and 2011. That's at the federal level. There are lots of states, purple states, where gerrymanders have had a similar enormous effect on policy at the state level. So take Wisconsin. Wisconsin is maybe the closest state in the country at the presidential level, at the gubernatorial level, whenever there's statewide elections. But because of the Republican gerrymander in 2011, Republicans never won less than 60% of the 100 seats in the Wisconsin House. And so for a full decade, now bleeding over into a second decade, we've had representation and policy outcomes in Wisconsin that are way more conservative, way more right-wing than the voters of Wisconsin want. And again, the culprit is gerrymandering. And there's similar examples on the Democratic side. If you look at someplace like Nevada, really contested purple state, extremely aggressive Democratic gerrymanders in place. And so legislation and policy just do not look like what the majority of Nevadans want there. And so that's why gerrymandering, I think, is a problem. In terms of commissions, independent commissions as a response to gerrymandering, I do think that as long as we're going to keep geographic single-member districts, some kind of commission is the obvious reform that we need. That's what every other country on Earth that's an advanced democracy with geographic districts uses. If you look abroad, Britain, Canada, Australia, they all used to suffer from gerrymandering and malapportionment just like we still do. But then each of those countries had big bang reform at some point. 100 years ago in Australia, in the 1940s in Britain, a little bit later in Canada. And the problem of gerrymandering basically went away in those English-speaking advanced democracies that rely on single-member geographic districts. Nobody worries about gerrymandering in Australia or Canada or Britain because trusted, nonpartisan expert commissions do the line drawing, not politicians. And the result is drastically more competitiveness, better scores on all partisan fairness measures, better compactness, much more respect for city and county boundaries, improvement along every axis, courtesy of this institutional reform. Now, in the US, we don't have the same expert established commissions in the states that use commissions. They tend to be ad hoc commissions that are recreated every decade. I would much prefer a model with more institutional memory, more training, more expertise, as opposed to getting citizen line drawers together every 10 years. But even these citizen line drawers are doing a heck of a better job than politician line drawers in the other 40 states. So, Brad mentioned some individual examples of particular commissions not achieving perfect proportionality. But of course, there are anecdotes going in every which way. What you want to do is look at commissions as a group compared to politicians as a group when it comes to redistricting. And if you take any measure of partisan fairness and look at commissions as a whole, they're doing a way, way better job than Democratic or Republican line drawers. There's a great paper on this by some political scientists very recently showing that, as expected, if Democrats draw the lines, you get a pro-democratic efficiency gap of around 10% on average. If Republicans draw the lines, you get on average a pro-Republican efficiency gap of around 10%. But this cycle in the 2020s, when commissions draw the lines, you get a mean and median efficiency gap of almost exactly zero, perfect fairness. And, there's some exceptions, an election here in Arizona, an election there in Washington State, but the overall tendency is very, very clear. And if the overall tendency isn't enough, a couple American commissions require the commissioners to look at partisan fairness data when they're doing redistricting. And Michigan is the best example of this. And so that introduces just an ex post check. Like, you think you've drawn a great map? Well, before you finalize it, check what the partisan fairness of that map would be and make sure it's not unintentionally skewed in either party's favor. And so Michigan has done that. And the Michigan maps are a revelation. They're quite competitive. They look so much nicer than the maps they replaced from the 2010s. And they've exhibited basically perfect partisan fairness at the congressional and state legislative level over the last couple elections. So I would still tweak the Michigan model. I think more institutional history, more expertise would be desirable. But something like the Michigan model, I think, would be a sound basis for reform in the U.S.
Brad, Nick just made the argument that at the congressional level, we did see big representational skewing in 2012 when voters across the country preferred Democrats but got a 30-seat Republican advantage. And then there are purple states like Wisconsin and Nevada where policy is much more liberal or conservative than it would otherwise be because of efficiency gap of 10% or more. Your response to that argument that gerrymandering really has made our politics even more polarized than they would otherwise be. And then let's turn to the question of whether you think that there are promising areas for reform.
Okay, well, I would point out that polarization is not the same as gerrymandering. I think these are separate issues that work out differently. An argument can be made that gerrymandering leads to polarization because if people are in safe seats, then they only need to appeal to their party stalwarts in the primary, which drives you toward the edge of the party rather than toward the center, and then keep your coalition together to eke out a victory in the general election. So that argument is there. On the other hand, we could just as easily say maybe we should reconsider having primary elections. That's another fundamental change to our election system that was enacted basically at a state level just a couple of decades ago and may not have been good. And so again, fairness and gerrymandering, or I'm sorry to say partisanship and gerrymandering are not entirely intertwined. I mean, a corresponding argument could be if you're sitting in a safe seat, you've got a better chance to be bipartisan, to know that you can try to control your future and every election you don't have to be looking over your shoulder all the time. So again, there's a lot goes into play there. I would challenge the notion that as a whole commissions are better. I don't have the numbers in front of me, unfortunately, but last fall when the issue was up here in Ohio again, I looked at every state that had a nonpartisan commission, and on the whole, they were less proportional than Ohio was. And I don't know how they compare all around the country, but Ohio had consistently been deemed to be one of the worst, most egregious Republican gerrymanders. And, at the time, it actually looked quite good compared to the overwhelming majority of independent districting commissions, at least if what you're after is some type of sort of proportional representation. And I think when we look at other countries, it is true, they don't talk about gerrymandering a lot, but 2012 was an exception in the United States. It is not something we see often. In fact, Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, all of these countries have had more elections in which a party got a minority of the vote, did not get at least a plurality of the vote, but still won a majority in their parliament or in their, lower house. So the idea that, because of one election in 2012, we have a unique problem that they just don't have in these other countries, I just think is fundamentally untrue. In recent decades, Australia, Canada, and Great Britain have all had governments in which the minority party in the vote, the aggregated vote, has won a majority of the legislature. Now, again, if you're like me and that isn't horribly disturbing, it's not ideal. You don't want that to happen all the time, but if it happens now and then, that's the natural happenstance of geographic districting. That's all right. But if you're going to argue that we need to go to, impartial boundary commissions so we avoid that, I don't think that has been the case. So back again to the problem, what is there to do? I think that to some extent, we need to remember that gerrymandering is somewhat self-limiting. Already there are concerns among many Republicans in Texas that they've redrawn these districts relying on Hispanic voters who voted in unusually large numbers for Trump as the Republican nominee compared to past Republican nominees. Are they really going to hold those voters? Or have they just put themselves in a position where they've done themselves in, where a whole bunch of districts are now going to swing Democratic in another election? And we have seen that before. Pennsylvania's Republicans did a gerrymandering in 2000 that was a little too harsh, tried to get too many seats out. And note that the more seats you try to gain for your party, the narrower your majorities become. And eventually, a very small shift in voter sentiment can lead to a party's, disaster. So I'm not convinced there's that big a difference. Even if you look at 2012, Republicans still had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. To me, the bigger problem is that neither party wants to operate on a bipartisan basis right now. Both parties seem to be absolutely determined to pass things only on a partisan basis, but neither party can get to 60 votes in the Senate with any kind of regularity or really much at all. And that is going to keep policymaking extremely difficult, but it does have one advantage, that it keeps it from, overwhelmingly going to one party that can use small, narrow majorities to enact sweeping changes. And that brings me just to the final point and why I'm not that perturbed. I mean, I think, obviously majority rules is a cornerstone of democracy. You don't want a situation where the minority is consistently gaining power over the majority. But if that happens now and then, remember, our system is full of all kinds of checks. The Senate, the fact that each state gets one House representative, informal, non-constitutional things like the filibuster, in the Constitution, separation of powers, federalism. All of these things are intended to try to foster a politics of compromise and working together. And right now, the parties have decided they don't want to do that. So it seems like policymaking has gotten really difficult. And I think our parties, if they just got back to the idea of, hey, wait a minute, we're all Americans. We're all in this together. When we win a narrow majority in Congress, our goal should not be to ram through whatever policies we think we can get on those narrow majorities, but to serve the whole nation, including respect for what the minority wants, some degree of compromise. Ultimately, that's the winning issue. And I realize that's a touchy-feely solution. People want some hard, specific measure. You can say we can undertake this measure and it will fix our democracy. But I don't think that measure is there. I think ultimately it has to come from us as voters and the people we elect to office, that we want policy that works well, that is built on consensus and compromise. And again, I'm just not certain that the focus on gerrymandering gets us there. So again, if states want to put in independent redistricting commissions, great. They can do that now. Some states have. I'm not sure it's had a great effect. States can use state constitutions to put more requirements on redistricting. We already have a lot of requirements by statute and by state constitution about compactness and so on. The reason they don't always work is because ultimately we're always trading off various values. So again, I come across, Jeff, I know, as the ultimate skeptic here, but I guess that's because I am. As I said earlier, I don't think gerrymandering is a good thing. I think it's just a thing. I think it's a feature of line drawing and geography. And I think we'd be better off to learn that's not the real problem that ails us. There are other things that we should be focused on.
Thank you very much for that. Well, it's time for closing thoughts in this great discussion. It's striking that we've focused entirely on the political aspects of gerrymandering without digging in on the constitutional restrictions, if any. And maybe we'll need yet another rematch for that. But in your final thoughts, Nick, might you touch on what's going on in the states? As Brad mentions, they can use their state constitutions to regulate gerrymandering. Some have. Those cases are being litigated. What does that litigation tell us about the possibilities of judicial supervision of gerrymandering? And what is the future of political gerrymandering?
Great. Let me just touch on a number of things as we close. So first off, with respect to gerrymandering and polarization, I agree with Brad that polarization is a major concern in modern American politics, and it's not right to attribute most or all of the increase in polarization to gerrymandering. Nate Persley at Stanford sometimes calls polarization the problem that nobody can explain and nobody can solve. Like we just don't have an institutional reform that we know about that would make a major dent when it comes to polarization. So, given the background of stark partisan polarization, the question then just is, do we want to have appropriate numbers of Democrats and Republicans in legislatures, or do we want to have lopsided numbers of liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans that don't reflect what the voters in the city or the state or the country want? And to me, that's the main issue with gerrymandering. Like fixing gerrymandering will not give us more moderate members of state legislatures or Congress, but it has the potential to give us the right numbers of Democrats and Republicans in Congress and state legislatures, which I think would still be a very big deal, even if the whole system still operates in the background of pervasive polarization. Then I want to just talk about gerrymandering being a thing, a bad thing, but a thing that's always been with us. If we think back over the course of American history, there have been many things, many bad things that we tolerated for decades, generations, centuries, but eventually got rid of. We talked about malapportionment. massive malapportionment went on for almost 2 centuries before it ended in the 1960s, just like that. When it comes to voting itself, we had property requirements to vote, gender requirements, racial requirements, and all of those eventually went by the wayside. If we had this conversation in 1950 or 1900 or 1850 or 1800, we would have talked about widespread disenfranchisement as just a thing, but now it's no longer a thing. And so, problems in our democracy that are things for a long time don't have to remain problems forever. And if you look abroad, gerrymandering, malapportionment were things in Britain and Australia and Canada and elsewhere until they weren't, and now they're just not things. Brad mentioned that abroad, there's no guarantee with their particular models that we always get a majoritarian outcome, and that's right. But majoritarian outcomes are a lot more likely abroad than they are in America when you have unfettered gerrymandering. So for my book, Aligning Election Law, I tallied wrong winner outcomes at the state legislative level. And there are dozens and dozens of these. They happen all the time. So, abroad, we can think of particular instances, New Zealand 40 years ago, this particular election in Canada or Britain. In America, wrong winner, non-majoritarian outcomes happen constantly. And the reason is often, although not always, gerrymandering. Abroad, too, the foreign commissions are party blind. They don't consider election results at all when they redistrict, with the one exception of the South Australian state government. And so it's not a total surprise that if you ignore election results, you might stumble your way into a wrong winner outcome. The response to that reality is not to throw up your hands and to say that wrong winner outcomes are inevitable. It's to say that, well, if we do a partisan fairness check at the end of the line drawing process, we can dramatically reduce the likelihood of a wrong winner outcome. And that's what Michigan does, and Michigan's maps have been phenomenal over the past couple of elections. I guess last thing I'll say, since Jeff, you asked me to comment on state level reforms, I'm simultaneously bullish and concerned about state level reforms. Bullish because they show us the path forward. Michigan shows us that a well-designed commission with a partisan fairness check at the end of the process can lead to really good maps. Litigation around the country has shown that what the U.S. Supreme Court thought was impossible is, in fact, very, very much doable. 2 days ago, the Utah court became the latest court to strike down a district map on partisan gerrymandering grounds. Certainly what state courts have done in Utah and Ohio and North Carolina and New York and Maryland and elsewhere is something that federal judges could also do. There's no greater expertise, greater capability, greater wisdom for state court judges as opposed to federal judges. But my big worry about state level reform is that when it applies to federal elections, it can result in lopsided unilateral disarmament. So I'm all for state level experimentation when it comes to state legislatures, city, county governments. But I worry a lot about independent commissions, partisan fairness checks, when, as is currently the case, mostly or only blue states adopt them. That's how we end up with, world record gerrymanders in Florida and Texas and North Carolina and elsewhere. And then, fair maps rather than offsetting maps in blue states. And that's a recipe for disaster at the federal level. And so my preferred course would be state level experimentation when it comes to state legislative and local legislatures. But I think nationally, the problem of gerrymandering requires a national solution, not a state level solution.
Thank you so much for that. Brad, last word in this wonderful and important discussion is to you. Please share your thoughts on the future of partisan gerrymandering.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Well, I suspect most listeners are going to feel much more sympathetic to Nick's arguments because we want there to be solutions for everything. But sometimes there's problems that can't be resolved in any real clear way. And again, I remain very skeptical. Nick talked about, things that used to be taken for granted but aren't. But, you don't have to disenfranchise Blacks. You don't have to have property requirements. If you have geographic districting, you have to draw political lines. And once you start drawing political lines, it's quite likely that politics is going to enter into the drawing. And when it doesn't, again, I don't know all the data on the states, and I'm sure Nick is correct because he's an excellent scholar and he studies this more than I do at the state level. But at the national level, we've actually done better than most of these other countries in making sure that the national legislature aligns with this sort of aggregated national popular vote, which, by the way, is also a fairly dicey measurement. If you even look at 2012 elections, you've got very, very close. I mean, the Democrats, both parties won less than 50% of the total vote. It's very close, about a percentage off or less. And that can be shaped by the quality of candidates, by some districts in which parties don't run candidates at all because they don't think they can win. It can be shaped by all kinds of things. So you're always getting risky when you start just aggregating vote totals and saying this is how it works. But we've done pretty well compared to other countries, at least on the national level. And to me, the big question in all these election reforms ultimately comes down to, are we better governed or are other people better governed? And if we're not better governed, is this the reason why? And I don't think, for all of our problems now, I don't think you can say that these other countries we point to as examples of better districting are better governed. The United States is getting more economic growth. We remain the world's predominant commercial, political, and cultural power. We still have precedent or freedoms that are essentially, unprecedented. For all the bad mouthing of America, and everybody complaining nowadays, this is one great country to be in, and one could do a lot worse. So this is where my innate conservatism comes out and says, let's be careful about just rocking the boat and suggesting that if we make this change, we're going to be better governed in some particular way. And I think that's ultimately where I would kind of rest things and ask, whether or not all these efforts, not just in gerrymandering, but a number of efforts in electoral reform over the last 2 or 3 decades have really served a purpose of making us better governed. And if I can, Jeff, because you read a couple of comments about Elbridge Gerry, but from contemporaries that were not so pleasant to him, I do want to read one more to wrap up. And this is John Adams, who said, if every man were a Gerry, the liberties of Americans would be safe against the gates of hell. So whatever we think about gerrymandering, let's remember Elbridge Gerry appropriately. Thank you, Jeff.
Beautiful. Love it. And in my Founders on the Founders, I have John writing to Abigail along the same lines that Gerry is an excellent man and an active, able statesman. I hope he will soon return hither. Thank you for that love for Elbridge Gerry. And thank you so much, Brad Smith and Nicholas Stephanopoulos, for a deep, engaged, empirical, civil, and really invaluable discussion of the future of partisan gerrymandering. On behalf of all the We the People listeners who asked for your return, thank you both.
My pleasure. Thanks for having both of us. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by Bill Pollack and Griffin Ritchie. It was engineered by Bill Pollack. Research was provided by Gyuha Lee, Griffin Ritchie, Ray Sullivan, and Tristam Worsham. Friends, I'm so excited that my new book is coming out on October 21st. It's called The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. I would love you to pre-order it on Amazon or elsewhere. And if you'd like, I would be honored to send you a book plate. So just write to me at jrosen@constitutioncenter.org. Tell me you've pre-ordered and I will send you a signed book plate. And I can't wait to hear what you think of the book. Please also recommend the show to friends, colleagues, or anyone anywhere who's eager, hungry, and determined, resolute, undeterred in their commitment to enjoying a weekly dose of constitutional illumination and debate like the one we just heard. And please look out at the incredible resources we're about to post. For Constitution Day, we're launching our new America at 250 Civic Toolkit in connection with a series of exciting events, including visits at the National Constitution Center by Akhil Amar and Justice Barrett. And always remember, in addition to all that the National Constitution Center is a private nonprofit. We rely on your generosity, passion, and engagement for all our programming. Please consider donating at constitutioncenter.org/donate. On behalf of the National Constitution Center, I'm Jeffrey Rosen.